All right, so at 2:30, you're ready to roll.
It's another minute.
A little bit less than a minute. Yeah.
Okay.
It's 2:30
Okay.
and welcome.
Thank you. So I guess I'll get started. So I am Kenning Poon. I'm an assistant professor at SUNY Old Westbury, down in Long Island, if you know where we are or don't know where we are. Today I am going to talk to you about the creation, adoption, and assessment of an OER lab manual for the Introductory Biology II Lab course. So essentially we created a lab manual for our Intro Bio 2 course, and I'm just going to go over what we did when we adopted this in our Bio 2 labs. Okay. Sorry, just so you know, I may have to move my screens around because I'm only using one screen, so just bear with me. Here we go. Okay, so SUNY Old Westbury, if you aren't aware, is actually the most diverse SUNY across the SUNY campus. So if you see here, the orange bars are us, the blue bars is SUNY-wide. We actually have a very large Hispanic/Latin population, as well as a Black population and other minorities as well. Our higher proportion of Hispanic and Latin students designates us as a Hispanic Serving Institute, which is very important because we actually recently acquired an NSF HSI grant, which I'll talk to you at the very end about. But pretty much our campus is very diverse. Many students are also first to college, and we also have a lot of EOP students, and many of our students also are on some form of financial aid. So just to paint a picture of the type of students that we have on our campus. So getting straight to the lab manuals that we use in our bio courses, the reason why we started with the Bio 2 lab is because I primarily teach the Bio 2 labs. Sometimes I teach the Bio 1, but this is one of the second semester in the introductory courses for the labs that students have to take if they're biology majors. And every year, year after year, teaching this course, students would have very similar complaints about the manual that we used. So the one we used was from Dolphin. This is from McGraw-Hill. We actually had a special edition made for our course. So it's a thinner volume with just experiments that were necessary to complete the lab. But the students often complained that this lab manual was very expensive. Oftentimes, they would not have the lab manual on the first week of class. It would take them up to second, third week of lab before they actually went out and purchased the lab manual because they were waiting for book vouchers or their next paycheck or something in order to pay for this lab manual. Some other common complaints that students would have were that the font was too small, so it made it difficult for them to figure out where they were supposed to read. There was too much text, not enough spaces, not enough breaks. And this created that issue of students not knowing exactly where they should be reading. And the material lists that was found in the lab manual didn't often match the materials that we actually had on hand. So they would be looking for things that we didn't actually have. So other complaints from faculty were that the students weren't reading the text. And this again goes back to the fact that the students were complaining that it was too wordy and the text was too small. Students had trouble finding the sections that they were working on. And there wasn't enough space for students to write answers and observations as they were going through the lab. So this made teaching the content from one instructor to a class of 25 and trying to help each individual student a bit problematic. If you imagine just me trying to walk around to every single student, by the time I got through, an hour had passed and more students had questions, trying to determine what they were working on. And so that these were some issues between students and faculty. So we started to look at OER manuals that were out there. And when we looked through, we saw some had some modules that were useful to us. Some had modules that weren't useful to us. And it really came down to the conclusion that it didn't quite align with our curriculum for what we were teaching in the lecture. And it also may not have aligned with the available technology that we had, because we are a small comprehensive college. Budget is just based on whatever is available every year to us. And one of the more important things is that it didn't include many CURE components. So CURE stands for Course Embedded Undergraduate Research Experiences. And many studies actually have shown that CUREs are actually very important, especially at a institution like ours, where we're serving a very large proportion of minority students, that CUREs are actually very important for reducing equity gaps, providing students with practical research backgrounds without students having to find that time to get research experience outside their courses. So having CUREs embedded in the curriculum is actually very helpful for students who are majoring in something like biology. And so all of these reasons pretty much got us to start thinking about creating some kind of lab manual for our own use for our students that would be affordable for them as well. Another thing to note is that a lot of our students actually understand that research is very important, but they don't actually actively seek out research experiences. And that was another reason why we wanted to focus on CUREs. And this is actually a paper that we published last year about our student demographics and their research motivation, which really led us to moving into this OER. So further push for us to create this lab manual. So the lab manual is actually freely available. So if anyone wants to access it, this is a QR code for it. And this is the web link. So this is to our library into the SUNY archives. So you can access the lab manual at any point if you'd like to see what kind of information is in there. So after we created the OER lab manual, we needed to track the students, their backgrounds, the demographics versus their assessing their grades and their perception to the lab manual as well. So we did a piecemeal. We did a pre-course survey and a post-course survey, trying to determine their demographics, their perception of their self in the sciences and their ability for that course, their perception of any kind of prior lab manual use, whether it was a paid version or some kind of OER. And then we also assessed them post-course survey, how they felt about the manual that we had created. We also did a course level assessment using grades. And a big question that came up was, how would we assess their grades while giving everyone equitable access to a free lab manual? And so we decided to compare their course grades across the semester to a prior year when we had used a purchased lab manual. So the last time we had used a purchased lab manual and we had in-person labs was pre-pandemic, so fall 2019. And that year I had actually taught all the sections. So it made the comparison a little more level, I guess, so that we didn't have too much differences between instructors, too many different instructors teaching it. So we compared the current assessment of the OER lab manual with that of the purchased lab manual in fall 2019. So that's the prior semester that we had compared with. So first off, we looked at the course demographic from pre and post, so the beginning of the course and the end of the course. And we did this for both pre and post because we wanted to make sure we were capturing similar demographics between gender. So we have mostly female in the course, and that didn't change much at the post course survey. And in looking at the race and ethnicity, they were pretty similar pre and post. And one thing to note is that the demographics match our campus demographics in terms of race and ethnicity. So Majority of them were Hispanic or Latin or Black and other types of minorities. So that was consistent and that was good. That means our responses were coming from similar demographics. So we were looking at their anticipated graduation dates. So this we took this information in fall 2023, spring 2024. Majority of them were actually graduating in spring 2026 or spring 2025. So this actually gives us another data point for something that was not part of the scope of this assessment. So that most of these students are sophomores and juniors taking an Introductory Biology II Lab. And that's something internally that we're trying to fix. We're trying to get these students to actually take it in their first year instead of their second and third year. But most of the responses are coming from students in their second and third year of college. So then we started to look at their overall perception of self and their abilities. So we did ask them some questions about their demographics, like their economic standing, their race, ethnicity, or their gender, whether or not it limited their ability to do well in the course. I'm sorry, this is missing, but this is the pre-course, the upper bars of the pre-course, and this is the post-course for each of the questions. And for these 3 questions here, most of the students did not feel that their demographics prohibited them from doing well in the course. So they felt pretty confident about themselves, which is good. That's what we want. And their confidence in things like writing lab reports and their ability to learn were pretty positive. So we felt really happy about that. And it didn't change much from the beginning of the course to the end of the course, suggesting that whatever it was that we were doing in the lab was good. Then we asked them about any prior use of any kind of paid lab manual. So it could be biology, it could be physics, it could be chemistry, and their perception of those lab manuals that they had purchased with their own money. At about 50-50 split, both pre and post, students said that the lab manual was confusing to them, which is not surprising because this was one of the common complaints that we would get from students using the paid biology lab manual. Students did overall leaning more towards they did well because of the lab manual in the course, and they found that their paid lab manual was useful and that they learned a lot from the lab manual, and that the lab manual was clear, concise, and easy to follow. So that was a little off based on the usual complaints, but overall students felt it was the paid lab manuals were good. And then in comparison, we asked the same students if they had used in the past any kind of OER lab manual. So again, it could be on physics, chemistry, or biology in any of these subject areas. Many of them have, a good number of them have used the OER, have used any kind of OER lab manual in the past. A good proportion of them did not. So those who selected yes, they were then asked follow-up questions on how they felt about the OER lab manual. And surprisingly, they also felt that the prior use of OER lab manual was also pretty confusing. But the other answers about doing well in the lab course and that the lab manual was useful and whether or not they learned a lot, these were all veering towards the positive end. So this was surprising to me. To us, we thought that perhaps it may have helped a little more since these OER lab manuals were geared more towards their specific content, the course curriculum. So we actually, after implementing our OER lab manual, we had asked similar questions because we wanted to know if there was any kind of shift in students' learning and perception of the lab manual. And again, students had a roughly half-half split of the lab manual being confusing. And this is fair because there were some mistakes in the lab manual. So we're actually revising, so as I'm speaking to you now, those trying to get out those little mistakes to make the content a little more smoother. But we do have more control over the lab manual in terms of what we're putting in there in comparison to what we had purchased. Overall, for the most part, the students did feel that the lab manual was pretty useful and that they learned a lot and it was clear, concise, and easy to follow. So this is pretty positive, and this is free for our students. So that's a really big plus. and they're getting the same kind of learning that they would have with the paid lab manual. So next, we assessed their grades. We wanted to know, were they performing at or better compared to a paid lab manual? So we compared again fall 2019 grades to the current grades in fall 2023 and spring 2024. These were combined this year, the grades for this entire year, because the students from both semesters had used this lab manual. And so they have 2 lab reports and 2 lab exams, and then they have their final grade. So first, the lab report. Sorry, there we go. So the orange is the OER lab manual that we created. The blue is the paid version. There wasn't a significant difference in terms of the average lab manual, lab report grades for either lab report 1 or lab report 2. But you could see that the distribution has a much wider range for the first lab report using the paid manual, whereas lab report 1 for the OER had a smaller distribution in terms of grades. Lab report 2 actually uses a cure component. So this is the exercise physiology experiment that the class had to do. So we had them divide up into 2, 3, 4 groups, depending on how large the class size was. And they would choose a specific characteristic that they wanted to compare in terms of exercise. So maybe the males versus females, or smoker versus non-smoker, or height, short versus tall. So they pick some of these demographics and run experiments on the using exercise in a biopack machine. And the distribution here is a little bit wider, but it doesn't deviate too much from using the paid manual. So the students were challenged a little bit with this unit here for the second lab report, with this, what I would call a mini cure. The lab exams, however, were significantly different. The lab exam 1, there was a significant increase in these exam scores. Lab exam 1 primarily tests their knowledge on plants, photosynthesis, and cellular respiration. So the students did improve using the OER lab manual, significantly improved. Plants were not something that students were fond of learning in the lab. So this was a very good jump, a very significant jump for us. Lab exam 2, however, was a slight decrease compared to the paid manual. And that may have to do with the fact that because of some of the lost days for labs, we ended up having to cram some of the contents into one lab session. So the second half primarily focuses on animal physiology and anatomy. And by compressing all of that across fewer weeks to accommodate the mini cure, the exercise physiology projects, we may have inadvertently reduced some of the learning content here. So this is something that we are also looking at, trying to figure out how to spread out the second half of the lab so that we can still have the mini cure involved, mini cure components within this lab manual and the lab itself. But overall, the final grade distribution did not deviate too much between the paid and the OER. So these are the averages of the final grades for the fall 2019 versus the fall 2023 and spring 2024 semester. There wasn't a significant difference between the grades, the overall grades between the two versions of the lab manual. But one thing that was pretty interesting was that our prior DFW rate was around 32.4%, and even semesters before 2019, it hovered around this rate, around 30%. Whereas implementing the new OER lab manual, we did see a decrease. In fall 2023, it was a 24.5%. Last semester, it decreased even more to 16.7% because we were working out the kinks as we were going through the fall. And so spring 2024 ran a little smoother. We believe that's the reason why the DFW rate decreased even more. So we're going to continue looking at this to see if this trend continues moving forward. So that's pretty much what I have to present to you. And I'd like to give the acknowledgements to the faculty in the Biological Sciences Department for going through all of this with me. And this is dedicated to Dr. Manya Mascareno, who is a collaborator on this, and she recently passed away. Our lab technicians, John and Janine, who again put up with me as I was trying to change all these things every week with our lab, trying to make sure that the labs run smoothly. And also like to thank SUNY OER Services, Impact Services Grant for awarding for funding this. Our previous study from the NSF SIZE and our new one, the NSF HSI Award, which continues this OER work, trying to expand to the Bio 1 lab, as well as using other technologies in the lectures now. So we're trying to get more, capture more of these first year students that are coming into our majors. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, I'll take them now.
Free to unmute and ask your questions, or you can put them in the chat. No questions. Oh, such a fascinating presentation and no questions. Christina says, good work.
Thanks.
Well, I thank you for your time and your presentation and all your hard work. On behalf of students, keep that up. I'm going to stop the recording.